There's a specific kind of silence that follows a shattered ego. It doesn't just fall, it detonates. For years, my brother-in-law thought I flew military cargo. But when a 4-star general crashed our family dinner, he finally learned exactly why they call me Falcon 1. The smell of my father's hickory-smoked brisket was supposed to be my grounding mechanism. It was supposed to be the olfactory bridge that pulled me out of the sandbox, the Middle Eastern combat zones I wasn't allowed to name, and back into the manicured, suburban reality of Oak Park, Illinois. It was Dad's 65th birthday. The driveway was packed with SUVs and sedans, but standing out like a sore thumb was a pristine silver Porsche 911. The vanity plate read CPT Brad. I let out a long, exhausted sigh, gripping the steering wheel of my beat-up Ford Bronco. Bradley Hayes, my older sister Sarah's husband. Brad was a first officer for a major commercial airline who had recently and loudly been upgraded to captain on the Boeing 737. If you spent more than 3 minutes in Brad's company, you knew this. He wore his aviator sunglasses indoors, strategically draped his company lanyard out of his pocket, and possessed a staggering amount of unearned confidence. I cut the engine, the familiar silence of the neighborhood washing over me. Just 48 hours ago, my ears had been ringing from the concussive roar of an F-35, a Lightning II's afterburner, screaming off a classified runway at 0200 hours. My neck still ached from pulling 9 Gs while evading a simulated and then very real surface-to-air missile lock over a hostile border. I had a fading bruise across my collarbone from the harness restraints, hidden neatly beneath my oversized flannel shirt. To the United States Department of Defense, I was Captain Chloe Mitchell. To the elite Tier 1 strike group I belonged to, I was Falcon 1, the squadron commander and lead interceptor. But to my family, I was just Chloe, the girl who flew supply routes for the Air Force Mobility Command. It wasn't a lie of malice. It was a lie of necessity. My security clearance demanded it. My father Arthur knew I was an officer and he was immensely proud, but he thought my biggest daily threat was turbulence over the Atlantic while delivering pallets of MREs to bases in Germany. I grabbed the wrapped bottle of 20-year-old Macallan I'd bought for Dad and walked toward the backyard. The chatter of family and friends grew louder, punctuated by a booming laugh I immediately recognized. So I tell air traffic control, I say, "Look, buddy, you either give me flight level 350 or I'm diverting to Dallas and you can explain it to the FAA. I stepped onto the patio. Brad was holding court by the outdoor fireplace, a craft beer in one hand, gesturing wildly with the other. A few of Dad's golfing buddies were nodding along politely. Sarah spotted me first. Her face lit up. "Chloe, you made it!" She rushed over, wrapping her arms around me. She squeezed a little too hard, right over my bruised collarbone. I managed a tight smile, suppressing a wince. "Wouldn't miss the big 6 to 5, I said, kissing her cheek. Dad emerged from the smoke of the grill, wielding a pair of tongs like a scepter, his eyes crinkled with pure joy. "There's my girl. The Air Force finally gave you a weekend pass?" "Something like that, Dad. Happy birthday." I handed him the scotch. As Dad admired the bottle, Brad sauntered over, his chest puffed out under a designer polo shirt. He looked me up and down, a familiar, patronizing smirk playing on his lips. Well, if it isn't the military's most expensive UPS driver," Brad chuckled, clapping me on the shoulder. "Good to see you, kid. How's the cargo business? You guys figure out how to stack boxes without dropping them yet?" I took a slow breath. "Compartmentalize," my training whispered. "It's going fine, Brad. Congratulations on the captain's seat. Sarah mentioned you finally got the 4th stripe." Brad grinned, clearly pleased. "Yeah, well, it was only a matter of time. You know how it is." "Actually, no, you probably don't. The airlines are a different beast, Chloe. High pressure, real consequences. You've got 150 souls sitting behind you, depending on your every micro-adjustment. It's a lot of weight." He took a sip of his beer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But hey, flying a C-17 full of toilet paper is honorable work too. Someone's got to supply the real warriors, right?" Dad frowned, his tongs pausing midair. "Brad, Chloe's an officer. She serves her country." "I know, Arthur, I know. I'm just giving her a hard time. Brad held up his hands in mock surrender. I'm just saying, commercial aviation is where the big boys play. You have to really know how to fly to handle a heavy jet in commercial airspace. The military basically flies you guys on autopilot from point A to point B. I smiled politely, picking at a piece of loose thread on my flannel. If only he knew that my autopilot last Tuesday involved inverted dives through anti-aircraft tracer fire at Mach 1.2, relying on instinct, muscle memory, and a prayer to keep a multi-million-dollar stealth fighter from becoming a fireball over the desert. It definitely has its challenges, I said mildly. Right, Brad scoffed, turning back to his audience. Anyway, as I was saying about the crosswinds in Denver, I excused myself and walked into the kitchen to grab a water. Sarah followed me in, looking apologetic. I'm sorry about him, she whispered, leaning against the counter. He's just, you know how he gets. He's really proud of the promotion. It took him 3 tries to pass the simulator checks for captain. I paused, raising an eyebrow. 3? Sarah hushed me, looking around frantically. Don't tell him I told you. He blames the instructors, says they were biased. Right, biased. I took a sip of my water. In my world, if you failed a sim check 3 times, they didn't just deny you a promotion. They pulled your wings and sent you to fly a desk in a windowless Pentagon basement. The margin for error in a dogfight was 0. Just let him have his moment today, okay? Sarah pleaded. I always do, Sarah. I always do. Dinner was served at a massive oak table, set up under the patio lights. The August evening was balmy, the sky bruising into shades of violet and deep blue. Dad sat at the head of the table, beaming as he surveyed his family and friends. I sat quietly near the end, content to eat my steak and listen to the crickets. But Brad, seated directly across from me, was not content with silence. He had an audience, and he was determined to use it. So, Chloe, Brad started, cutting into his steak with loud scrapes of his knife against the ceramic plate. You're getting up there in years for a military pilot, aren't you? What are you, 31? 32 next month, I replied, not looking up. Right. So, what's the plan? You gonna transition out soon? Because I was talking to the chief pilot at my airline, and I might be able to put in a good word for you. You'd have to start at the bottom, obviously. Regional jets, puddle jumpers, but your cargo hours might translate. Dad chimed in. Chloe loves the Air Force, Brad. They're lucky to have her. I'm sure they are, Brad said smoothly. But let's be real, it's a stepping stone. And frankly, the airlines are getting tough on hiring. They want real stick and rudder skills, not just system operators. He pointed his fork at me. Have you ever even handled a severe in-flight emergency, Chloe? Or does the computer just tell you to eject? The table went quiet. Even Sarah looked down at her plate, her cheeks flushing. I looked at Brad. I looked at his perfectly styled hair, his smug expression, the complete lack of understanding in his eyes. My mind flashed back to a mission 6 months ago, over the South China Sea. A catastrophic hydraulic failure caused by a near miss with foreign debris, warning alarms blaring, the cockpit filling with smoke. I had to manually fly a 50,000-pound brick of radar-absorbent metal through a zero-visibility storm, landing it on a carrier deck with no brakes, relying on the tailhook and pure adrenaline. I had nightmares about that night for a month. I blinked, the patio lights coming back into focus. I've had a few bumps along the way, I said softly. Brad laughed, a harsh, grating sound. A few bumps. Cute. Last month, I lost an engine over the Rockies. Full-blown compressor stall. Passengers were screaming. Flight attendants were crying. I had to take manual control, single engine, and put it down in Salt Lake City. He leaned forward, lowering his voice for dramatic effect. That's what separates the boys from the men, Chloe. No offense. But when the lives of 150 civilians are on the line, you don't have the luxury of a parachute. You have to be a real pilot. I put my fork down. The metal clinked loudly against the plate. A real pilot, I repeated. Exactly, Brad smirked, taking a long drink of his beer. Real pilots only in this family. You do your time in the military, you get your little participation medals, and then you leave the actual airspace to the professionals. Dad slammed his fist on the table. The glasses rattled. Brad, That is enough. In my house, you will respect your sister-in-law's service. Arthur, relax, Brad said, holding his hands up defensively. I'm just trying to give her some career advice. She's pushing papers in the sky. I'm just trying to help her bridge the gap to reality. Before I could say a word, before Dad could kick him out, the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway shattered the tension. Everyone turned their heads. A sleek, black Chevrolet Suburban with tinted windows had pulled up directly behind Brad's Porsche, blocking it in. The vehicle had government plates. Brad frowned. Who the hell is that? They're blocking my car. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a crisp Air Force dress uniform stepped out. He walked around the vehicle and opened the rear passenger door. My blood ran cold. Stepping out into the humid Illinois night was a tall, silver-haired man. His dress blues were impeccable. The ribbons on his chest looked like a colorful quilt of American history, but it was the stars on his epaulets that caught the patio light. 1, 2, 3, 4. General Thomas Harding, Commander of Air Combat Command. The man who personally signed my highly classified deployment orders. The man who technically wasn't supposed to know where I lived unless it was a matter of national security. The chatter at the table died instantly. Dad stood up, his military history buff instincts kicking in, though he clearly didn't comprehend what was happening. Brad scoffed, though his voice was a little higher than usual. What's this, Chloe? Your commanding officer come to make sure you delivered the mail on time? I ignored him. I stood up, pushing my chair back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I smoothed down my flannel shirt, suddenly painfully aware of how out of uniform I was. General Harding walked up the stone path to the patio, his expression unreadable. He bypassed Dad, bypassed Brad, and stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. Without hesitation, I snapped to attention. Heels together, spine rigid, hands pinned to my sides. General Harding looked at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, formally, he raised his hand and executed a perfect, crisp salute. Generals do not salute captains first. It defies every rule of military protocol. Unless. It was a gesture of supreme, profound respect. I returned the salute, my hand trembling slightly. At ease, Captain Mitchell. Harding's voice boomed, rich and gravelly. I dropped my hand, assuming the parade rest position. General Harding, sir, to what do I owe the honor? Harding didn't smile. He reached inside his breast pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I apologize for interrupting your father's birthday, Captain, Harding said, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silent patio. But the Pentagon has declassified the events of Operation Desert Scythe as of 20 minutes ago. The president wanted this delivered personally, before the press briefing at 2,100 hours. Behind me, I heard Brad let out a confused, nervous chuckle. Operation what? Is this a joke? Harding slowly turned his head, locking eyes with Brad. The general's gaze was like a laser-guided munition. Are you the brother-in-law? Brad swallowed hard, his unearned confidence evaporating instantly. Yes, sir. Bradley Hayes. Captain Hayes, actually. Commercial. Harding looked him up and down with an expression of mild disgust. Well, Captain Hayes, it seems you are sitting in the presence of the deadliest fighter pilot in the United States Air Force, and I suggest you keep your mouth shut while I address her. Harding turned back to me, opening the velvet box. Inside rested the Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Captain Chloe Mitchell, Harding said, his voice echoing in the night. Call sign, Falcon 1. The silence on the patio was no longer just quiet. It was a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. The crickets seemed to have stopped chirping. The distant hum of suburban traffic vanished. There was only the heavy breathing of my father, the wide-eyed shock of my sister Sarah, and the pale, sweating face of Bradley Hayes. General Harding didn't look at any of them. His steely gray eyes remained locked on me. He held the velvet box open, the gold and bronze of the Navy Cross catching the ambient light of the outdoor lanterns. It is the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a member of the United States Armed Forces, usually reserved for the Navy and Marine Corps. For an Air Force pilot to receive one meant the operation was joint, highly classified, and unimaginably brutal. "Arthur," General Harding said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a solemnity that demanded absolute attention. He finally turned his head to look at my father. "Your daughter couldn't tell you where she was on the night of April 14th. She told you she was running a supply route to Ramstein Air Base in Germany." "That was a cover." Dad gripped the edge of the table. Where was she, General?" "She was 60,000 feet over hostile territory in a theater of operations. We are only just now acknowledging," Harding explained, stepping closer to the table, the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes. A joint extraction team of Navy SEALs had been compromised deep behind enemy lines. Their exfiltration helicopters were shot down. They were pinned down in a canyon, surrounded by 2 battalions of enemy combatants, and they were running out of ammunition. I stared straight ahead, the parade rest posture keeping my trembling hands locked behind my back. My mind didn't just hear the general's words. It teleported me back to that cockpit. The suffocating smell of aviation oxygen, the flashing red threat indicators on my tactical display, the frantic, static-laced screams of the ground commander on the comms channel. "Air support was 2 hours away," Harding continued, his gaze drifting over the frozen guests. "But Captain Mitchell was in the sector, flying a solo reconnaissance patrol in an F-35 Lightning. Her orders were strict observation. Do not engage. Do not reveal her stealth position." Brad swallowed loudly. His arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of sheer disbelief. He looked like a man who had just realized the puddle he was splashing in was actually the edge of a bottomless ocean. "The enemy scrambled 6 fifth-generation interceptors to finish off our boys on the ground," Harding said, his voice tightening with a mixture of anger and fierce pride. 6 heavily armed, hyper-maneuverable hostile jets against 1 American pilot whose primary weapon was stealth, not a full combat payload. Captain Mitchell had a choice: follow her standing orders and watch 24 American fathers and sons die on a live satellite feed, or engage and reveal her position. Knowing the odds of her survival were calculated at less than 4%. Sarah let out a stifled sob, her hand covering her mouth. "Captain Mitchell didn't ask for permission," Harding boomed, turning back to Brad, ensuring the commercial pilot felt every single word. "She disabled her transponder, broke stealth protocol to draw their radar locks, and engaged a 6-to-1 dogfight in pitch darkness. She pulled 12 Gs, enough to shatter the blood vessels in her eyes and tear the ligaments in her neck. She systematically dismantled the enemy squadron over 45 minutes of continuous, high G-force aerial combat." Harding paused, letting the silence ring. "When she ran out of missiles," the general said softly, "she used her internal cannon. When she ran out of ammunition, she used her aircraft's kinetic energy, flying within 50 feet of the canyon walls at Mach 1.3, creating a supersonic shockwave that collapsed a rock face directly onto the advancing enemy ground forces, shielding the SEALs until the extraction birds arrived." Dad was crying now, silent tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "She landed her jet on a classified carrier deck with a ruptured fuel line, critical hydraulic failure, and 42 bullet holes in her fuselage," Harding finished. The commander of the SEAL team stated in his official report that they are alive today solely because of an angel that descended from the stratosphere. Her squadron calls her Falcon 1. The enemies of this nation just call her a ghost. Harding snapped the velvet box shut and stepped toward me. He didn't pin the medal on my flannel shirt. Instead, he pressed the box firmly into my right hand. "The president sends his personal gratitude, Chloe," Harding whispered, just low enough that only I could hear. "You did good, kid." "Just doing my job, sir," I whispered back, my throat tight. "You're off restricted duty," he added, stepping back. "Take a week, then I want you back at Nellis. We need you instructing the new recruits." "Yes, sir." Harding turned around to face the table one last time, his eyes locked onto Brad like a predator, zeroing in on wounded prey. The contrast between the 2 men was staggering. Brad, in his designer polo and tailored shorts, suddenly looked like a child playing dress-up. "Now," Harding said, his voice dangerously calm. "Captain Hayes, was it?" Brad tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat violently. Yes, General. Brad Hayes, United Airlines. United, Harding mused, pulling a sleek smartphone from his pocket and tapping the screen. You mentioned earlier that you had to take manual control of a passenger jet with a compressor stall over Salt Lake City. You said it separated the boys from the men. Is that accurate? Brad looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. I was just making conversation, sir. Just, pilot talk. Pilot talk, Harding repeated, the disgust dripping from his words. That's interesting, because I happen to play golf every Sunday with Richard Vance, the chief operations officer of your airline. He's a former wingman of mine. Brad's face drained of all color. He was whiter than the tablecloth. Richard was just telling me about a certain captain who recently got upgraded. Harding continued smoothly, tapping his phone. A captain who panicked during a routine altitude simulation check and completely froze up. A captain who, during a minor compressor stall last month, actually handed the controls over to his 25-year-old first officer while he hyperventilated in the left seat. The airline is currently reviewing his flight status pending a psychological evaluation. The silence returned, but this time it was suffocatingly heavy with Brad's complete and utter humiliation. Sarah stared at her husband in horror. Is that true, Brad? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. You told me you saved that plane. Brad looked down at his lap, unable to meet her eyes, unable to meet my father's eyes, and most certainly unable to look at me. He had built his entire identity on a mountain of exaggerated machismo, and General Harding had just vaporized it with a single phone call. You see, Hayes, Harding said, leaning over the table slightly, his aura commanding the entire backyard. There is a massive difference between wearing the uniform and earning the right to wear it. The military doesn't fly planes on autopilot from point A to point B. We fly into the jaws of hell so that men like you can complain about crosswinds in Denver while drinking craft beer in the suburbs. The general stood up straight, adjusting his dress coat. You wanted to know if Captain Mitchell ever handled a severe in-flight emergency. The answer is yes. And unlike you, she didn't hand the stick to someone else when the sky started burning. General Harding didn't stay long after that. He declined my father's stammering offer of a drink, gave me one final, respectful nod, and walked back to his black Suburban. The heavy doors slammed shut, the gravel crunched, and the vehicle disappeared into the warm August night, leaving behind a family forever changed by the truth. Nobody spoke for a full 3 minutes. Dad was the first to move. He slowly walked over to me, ignoring everyone else, and looked down at the velvet box in my hand. His hands were shaking as he reached out, gently touching the gold edges of the Navy cross. Chloe, he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know. My God, sweetheart, the danger. I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his shoulder just like I did when I was a little girl. I'm sorry I lied to you, Dad. I hated doing it, but the mission, I couldn't risk it. It was a matter of national security. Dad held me tight, kissing the top of my head. You never have to apologize to me, Chloe. Never. I have always been proud of you. But today, I am in awe of you. I pulled back and looked at the rest of the table. The golfing buddies were staring at me with a mixture of reverence and shock. And then there was Brad. He hadn't moved. He sat perfectly still in his chair, staring blankly at his half-eaten steak. The vanity of his sunglasses, the brag of his Porsche, the heavy pilot's watch on his wrist, all of it seemed completely stripped of its meaning. The illusion he had so carefully crafted had been shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Sarah stood up. She looked at her husband with a complex mix of pity and profound disappointment. She didn't yell at him. She didn't cause a scene. She simply walked over to me, hugged me fiercely, and whispered, I am so incredibly proud to be your sister. She then turned to Brad. I think it's time for us to go home, Bradley. Brad didn't argue. He didn't boast. He didn't make a sarcastic remark. He slowly stood up, keeping his eyes glued to the patio stones, and walked toward the driveway. There was no swagger in his step. The man who had entered the backyard like a conquering king was leaving like a ghost. I watched the silver Porsche back out of the driveway, its engine roar sounding hollow and pathetic in the wake of everything that had just happened. The rest of the evening transformed into something quiet and deeply meaningful. Dad poured the 20-year-old Macallan I had brought him, and we sat by the fire pit. He didn't ask me for the classified details of the dogfight, he knew better now. But he asked me about the G-forces, about the camaraderie of my squadron, about the quiet moments above the clouds, when the world below looked peaceful. For the first time in my career, I didn't have to talk about imaginary pallets of MREs or pretend to care about forklift maintenance. I could talk about the stars as seen from 60,000 feet. I could talk about the fierce bond between pilots who trust each other with their lives at supersonic speeds. I was no longer just the daughter who flew cargo. The masquerade was over. As the fire died down and the guests finally went home, Dad and I sat alone on the patio. The velvet box rested on the small table between us, a silent testament to the secrets I had carried for so long. Dad picked up his glass, swirling the amber liquid. He looked at me, a soft smile playing on his lips. "You know," Dad said, his eyes twinkling in the dim light, "I always thought you drove that old Ford Bronco because you were frugal. But now I realize, when you spend your weekdays flying a $100 million stealth fighter jet at Mach 2, a Porsche probably just feels a bit sluggish, doesn't it?" I laughed a genuine, deep, belly laugh that I hadn't felt in months. The tension that had lived in my shoulders since my deployment finally evaporated into the humid Illinois air. "Yeah, Dad," I smiled, leaning back in my chair and looking up at the vast dark sky above us. The same sky that was my office, my sanctuary, and my battlefield. It really does. The commercial airlines could keep their comfortable schedules, their autopilot routines, and their inflated egos. I belonged to the stratosphere. I belonged to the silence of the tactical channels and the roar of the afterburner. I belonged to the sky. And from now on, whenever my brother-in-law looked up at a vapor trail cutting across the clouds, he would know exactly what a real pilot looked like. If you felt the adrenaline of this military showdown, smash that like button. We love bringing you these high-stakes, real-life drama stories where arrogance meets raw reality. What would you have done if you were in Chloe's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this story with anyone who loves a perfect dose of karma, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next gripping narrative. Stay soaring.